Really, by way of an introduction, a nice starting point would be for you to just sort of a brief overview, introduction to yourself. I guess, bringing in that sort of leadership thread, that's always a sort of important narrative for us, and how that kind of experience has influenced your work, both in the sector and more recently. If that's okay, as a kind of starter for 10 question.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I've been in as you know, in the financial services industry and identity management and actually technology space for over 25 years. And when I was in college, I grew incredibly fascinated with what we called computer information systems at that time, which dates me slightly, but nonetheless, it represents exactly what kind of R&D and development and engineering represent today. And candidly, Matthew, like during that time in my career or during that time in my life, like I wasn't as confident studying it in college. At the same time, I was like incredibly fascinated with these real world problems. And there was and there was this moment in my life where I remember that it's like, you got to put the fear aside and you got to kind of jump into it and you got to go after your ambitions. And I did that, and it landed me in a place where I got to study computer systems in the real world with some friends of my family who own just a small consulting shop. And that was really the catalyst for me to, bridging my life in technical sales to technology, and then moving forward, falling into financial services at a place when it was not very sexy. And it was just, like, it wasn't. And it was, you think about financial services, you think about big banks, and you think about, investment houses. And it was at a time when PayPal was just bought by eBay. And I started to work with them and became fascinated with the intersection of technology and payments and later on identity. But when you ask a little bit about kind of what influenced that approach and why did I stick with that, I was brought up in, a privileged home. It wasn't that it was given to my family. They worked really, really hard for that. And they're really big about role modeling the importance of, living a life in service to others and living a life of humility and, working for what you have. And so growing up in that environment, Irish, German, Italian household. So, take that where you want to, as far as the type of conversations we had around the dinner table. It was very important for us to learn about financial responsibility and the importance of how you can solve and help those problems for others. And in doing so, how do you lead a world of change in which you can be in service to others? Because that's why, we chose to get up every day in my family.
Going back to those kind of early days, as you were talking about, when you sort of took the plunge, as it were, you said, and threw yourself into it, having that initial, I guess, being a bit hesitant about moving fully into the sector and learning in academia and so on. I mean, is that kind of spirit or that pioneering spirit something that you've sort of carried through all of your career then? Do you think that's really important as a leader and someone to be successful, to have that kind of willingness to just go for something?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I mean, and we all experience that at different times in our lives, like whether it's, a personal event or a professional event where you decide like it's better to take the leap than to withhold and wonder and have regrets. And so part of my upbringing, that plunge, was not wanting to have any regrets in my life. And so, leadership to me has always been a privilege, and it is something that is earned. And it's a fascinating topic because leadership in general, I think, while the foundation of the characteristic of what leadership is stays tried and true, regardless in the world we were 50 years ago versus the world we are today, whether you're trying to lead in a physical environment versus leading in a virtual environment, which I think is the next kind of challenge for leadership. It really does embody certain characteristics. And one is about, taking leaps of faith and having vision and ambition and having a point of view that an issue that's on the table, can be solved creatively. And I think far too often, people hold back, not believing that they can be part of the change when the reality is someone has to do it. So why shouldn't it be you? And that was the way that I was brought up, and that's the way I've led for the last 20 years. And I think that's what leadership needs to do today, which is putting yourself aside and taking a lot of risks so you can role model for others that change is possible.
I often ask people this when I'm interviewing them and get different answers, I guess. I mean, do you think that there's anything specific to the financial services industry in terms of leadership or certainly kind of driving an organization that perhaps is different to how you would approach a different industry, a different sector, or anything like that? I mean, what are the kind of core drivers in finance perhaps that shape or mold you as you progress through a career?
Well, I've thought a lot about this question because as I said earlier, it depends on what you believe leadership is. And I do believe it is about vision and ambition and mobilization and motivation. And I to do that, it transcends any industry. That being said, one aspect of leadership that I don't think we talk enough about is about creating a trusted environment and being a trusted leader. And that is an attribute of leadership that in the financial sector, I think is, really rooted in how can you change an industry that has been so wrought with fraud or speculation or distrust and so leading as a trusted individual with a vision of what the future of finance is and a vision of what the future payments could be, I think is incredibly paramount for that sector. At AU10TIX, and I know we'll talk about that a little bit later, but when we talk about wanting to create a more secure and inclusive world where identities can be validated and verified and authenticated, it's all about trust. It's knowing that who's on the other side of whether it's a Zoom call or it's a payment or it's a transaction. And so having a trusted culture and a trusted leader, absolutely has to embody the ethos of what you're trying to sell in the market. Does that answer your question, Matthew?
It does. Yeah, absolutely. It's just one that I always find quite interesting. I mean, particularly as I guess the financial services sector and a lot of industries that are dealing with and implementing new technology and digital and so on, there's such rapid change. I mean, I assume that comes into how you approach your role and how you're a leader and how you approach how you sort of drive an organization as well. I mean, does that pace of change, do you think, is it higher than other industries? Where do you think finance is at in terms of sort of digital change?
I think it depends where in the financial sector you're sitting.
Sure, yeah.
Like if it's in payments, it's very different than where we are with insurance or investments right now. I mean, they're all kind of on different pace of rapid disruption. Payments was the first vertical to fall within the financial sector, as you know. So, and I also think it depends on what type of entity you're sitting at when you are driving that change. So my experience at PayPal was far different than my experience at Citi. And while the need to respond to the rapid pace of the market was equally as important, and you needed to be an agile leader. Like, I think that's one thing that, we're talking more and more about, and being an agile leader just isn't in how you deliver code. It isn't just about how you think. It's also about how you change your organization to evolve and shape what it is you're trying to do. And, that has to happen sometimes monthly. It doesn't happen once a year with these, big, announcements with org changes. And so, but to answer it directly, I think with the financial institutions, while you need the adaptability and while you need the ability to lead in a rapid world, you also need a quality that a lot of people don't think enough about, which is patience. Driving change in a massive organization, you may have the vision and you may believe what's right, supported by market data, but the reality is like getting 100,000 or 200,000 people to see that does not happen overnight. And being able to hold that almost contradiction of a vision and where the company is and where they need to go, and taking smaller steps versus big leaps, is a very different quality set, I think.
How do you do that? I guess without making that such a direct question. I mean, if you're looking at that again, you talk about that sort of change and that level of change. how do you approach that? How is it something that you have approached in the past? I mean, obviously you've extensive experience of this and the sector. I mean, how do you approach that, and how do you ensure that your team and your organization is on board with that change and is all driving towards the same goal and same target?
It's I've learned by having a lot of battle scars, I'll say that, where there's been moments where you have conviction and where your organization or a company needs to head, and you go there too quickly, or you go there trying to say, you've got the answer. Why can't everybody else come along? And you're being someone who's actually the resistor versus someone who's trying to take the right steps towards driving change. And through that, it has become about the ability to hold the vision in your head, to slowly share it with people who understand kind of the broader intention of every step you take. And then the people who don't, to allow them to live in their area where they have the utmost influence and drive them towards where you want to be. And, we talk a lot about, strategy without execution is pointless, and execution without strategy is meaningless. And to have a strategy and then to find ways in which you take small steps that sometimes, are unbeknownst to other people of why you're doing what you're doing as a leader. But it's actually in service to that bigger vision, I think is one of the most important things to do. And, I just got off of a call with a woman who's the CEO of a company I'm a chairman of, and we were talking about manifesting this notion in the media about where the world of valid donations are headed. So how do you verify the need that you, Matthew, need free access to maybe healthcare, or you need free access to accommodations because you've been hit by COVID and you've lost your job? Like, how do you know that these people who are getting actual goods and services from big brands actually have that need? Because there isn't something like there. So, and she's got a vision for actually solving that on a platform base and to creating this needs score, a verification score that scores people of their relative needs and trustworthiness. And I said to her, I go, part of this is about you having that point of view and repeating it. And then finding ways in which you can tell that narrative where it resonates with what people do day to day. And it's something we did at Citi for 3 years, 3.5 years. When we started Citi, which was the Citi FinTech organization that was really about driving disruption within the large FI, looking for new vectors of growth and putting new product in the market at accelerated pace. What would take 5 years, we did in 5 months. We had a very strong view from day one. It took us 4 years to get there.
Right. But that's part of the joy of doing the journey, I guess.
That's part of the joy of doing the journey. No, literally. That's what people say, like, it's never about the
is that a cliche,
it's all
or is
about
that
the way there.
Is that true, or is that a cliche? I don't know.
It depends on what you have to believe, right?
I was going to say, I think there's some sort of mantra I've heard before where it's something to do with something about riding the waves. You're reaching the destination, but you're actually enjoying the glory of the ride.
Yeah. No, it's.
I think it's easier to say that when you finish the journey, probably.
Yeah.
Right?
It is. Well, and you'll probably appreciate this, just having studied the space for so long, like having been at PayPal at the early days when there was only 1,000 people, and seeing like the potential that this company had to really solve for financial inclusion and to allow people to be part of a bigger ecosystem that they never would have had the opportunity for. I mean, eBay and PayPal back in 2002 were just really opening up the world to what was possible, where people didn't have access to the commerce opportunities to make a living. And, I remember thinking to myself, like, I want to be, in my lifetime, I'm going to help change the future of payments. Like, and M-Pesa came out in Kenya, I'm like, I'm going to make it happen. And while I feel, and I'm honored to have played a role in that, I think, this is the definition of it's a long journey and it probably won't happen in my lifetime, but there's moments, there's these inflection points, like I think with COVID, which really accelerate the adoption curve. And we're seeing that. I mean, evidentially we're seeing that, which is quite exciting.
referencing PayPal and eBay and other companies that have moved into the payments and the financial sphere. I mean, do you think that that's really the future of the sector? Do you think that incumbents, I mean, how do they manage new players coming into the sector, big tech companies, you know, organizations that weren't, I guess, traditionally financial services as perhaps we knew it in a sort of legacy style? Is that just an irreversible trend that will continue? And do you think that the ecosystem will broaden with different players and different entrants and so
on? The answer to all that's, you know, yes, I do think that it will broaden. I think we're seeing that. There's one of the reasons why I went from an alternative payments provider, which is what PayPal was in the early days, to a traditional incumbent financial institution was I felt really strongly that the change in that sector was going to happen through partnerships. That, you know, when you're trusting your money and trusting your data, you want to trust that as a consumer to a brand you know versus a brand that you don't know. And that's a lot of reasons why, at least up until recently, when we were at Citi and the FI, we looked at all of these disruptors. Well, the technology was tremendous, and we would benefit hugely from a partnership, which is really what our mantra was, is, you know, partner, buy, then build versus, you know, build, buy, then partner, which was traditionally, you know, the mindset in the large institutions. Is we started to realize that where we had scale and we had consumer brand recognition and trust. So there was still, I think a study I did about 2 years ago, you know, 70% of consumers would still trust their bank more with their data than other unknown brands. What we didn't have was the innovation. And what we didn't have was the new ways in which you engage with your customers and channels, using their, you know, information or signals to make it a personalized experience. And so I do think, Matthew, the convergence of the two is what's going to drive the most disruption. And I also believe that if you take signs from what's happened around the globe, is none of us can ignore. And I think it's more and more prevalent, particularly in Asia, where, you know, payments and FI is getting embedded in your day-to-day experiences, that you don't. I've talked a lot about payments becoming an invisible transaction that happens behind the scenes, because through the use of, you know, these lifestyle experiences, the use through this, you know, massive shift to, you know, to digital, and the fact that, you know, there's logic and algorithms and machine learning that can detect that you, Matthew, you know, use cash or credit card for this type of transaction. They're not even going to ask you unless there's some sort of risk trigger. You know, you're going to see, this is why you see Amazon and Apple and others that can naturally get into the space that never could before.
But I mean, that's really also, like you say, I mean, that's consumer driven to a degree, right? Because do you agree with that? That it's largely kind of led, I guess, by our changing behavior, well, the way that we our behavior and the way that we interact with technology and the way we need and consume technology.
Yeah, I do agree with that. But I also think for these, you know, incumbent institutions to play a role in that, they've had to change the way their policies. They've had to change, you know, how do they go from a closed network to an open network in a secure and safe way, while still maintaining their obligations with regulation and the regulators and with the laws? How do they move from being, you know, a very antiquated technology stack to one that has open APIs? And, you know, you've written about that, and it's something, you know, we did at Citi, which was a huge mind shift, because it changes the way that the company thinks about information flow and thinks about access levels and thinks about risk tolerance. And, you know, you look at what happened in Australia with their whole open banking initiative, which is just beyond banking. If you remember, it was also about utilities and telco and all the types of services that consumers consume. And I think that has been a huge catalyst to drive the partnership adoption that's been needed.
That's great. I mean, we should move on to identity and verification.
This is so fun.
It is. I feel I've asked you certainly enough questions on leadership, unless we can find another way to feed that back in. I mean, I guess the the idea of identity verification, certainly from my perspective, and security and privacy, that all feeds into what we were talking about there with consumer demand, how we use technology, and also how banks have to react to that, right? So, but maybe as a starting point, could you kind of just introduce AU10TIX? I got it right. I hope I did. Good. Yeah, really. I guess the sort of genesis behind that and how the company has evolved as the industry and the sector has evolved as a kind of starting point.
Yeah. So AU10TIX has a bit of an interesting story. So our headline is identity intelligence. Effectively, that we've been doing ID verification and authentication for over 10 years, and as the sector has expanded in what does that mean beyond a government issued ID, and how do you bind, biometrics as well as third-party data sources and other types of techniques to validate that you are who you say you are. Clearly we've started to expand in that space as well. What's unique about the company, in addition to it being 100% automated, which was and just a great technology stack, which is one of the reasons why I joined, is it actually started out in the airport control and border control, so airport security and border control area back in the early 1900s. I'm sorry, 1900s. Yeah, can you imagine being around that long? No, the 1990s. So their parent company is actually still in the space, and so is the management team started to see a shift from physical IDs to moving in the digital sphere. And I think with one of our first clients that forced us to move us into the cloud back in the early 2000s, that really was the catalyst for us. And our whole intention is verifying consumers' identities so that businesses can provide safer and secure services. And we spend a lot of our customers have come from the tech space, a lot of the names and brands that but we have also clearly gone into FI and fintech and other areas where, again, I think this pandemic that we're up against has just created another acceleration point for a lot of companies to not just recognize their need to be able to perform all their services digitally online and do verification online that may have happened in a branch, but also has opened up new sectors, Matthew, that I always thought was ripe for disruption, but now it's happening a lot sooner than I thought it would. Healthcare and education and content.
Interesting, isn't it? And I guess, like you say, with that shift to everything being online, is identity verification, digital identity. I mean, I guess that will just be prevalent everywhere. Is that the way it's going? I mean, surely yes, right?
Surely yes. I mean, if you think about everything you do every day, like you got up this morning, what did you do this morning?
Well, as someone else in the company will watch this, I will say I've worked since the moment I've been awake, but I logged onto my phone. I did check my bank. All of those require identity of some sort.
Identity verification. That's exactly it. And now you've moved. Think about education. So now you've moved an entire sector online for a period of time that probably won't totally go away. And you ask yourself, when these kids take their test, when people submit work for their college, like, how do you know that person actually did the work and then actually, they're the person submitting the work? Healthcare is just, I've become obsessed with over the last couple months, because as I've had to go to doctors, I've had situations where my experience is I get a text to sign up for a Zoom session. The Zoom session doesn't verify who I am. I speak to the doctor I've never seen before. I don't know if the doctor is actually a credible doctor. Okay, so we could take that to that level. They give me a diagnosis. They send me a prescription. I sign on to my, pharmacy. I say I want to pick up my prescription. I pick up my prescription. No one along that path asks me to verify who I am. No one.
That's
and
incredible.
I've got over-the-counter drugs. And granted, it was prescribed to me, but I look at that, and then I take the next scenario, which I've, recently had. I had to go to the physician, and again, I did the entire patient check-in experience digitally. They did ask for my ID. They did ask for my insurance card, but there was no validation of it, Matthew. And so then you tie that, you bind it to a payment, because I have to pay for that service somehow, whether it's verification of the health insurance I have, or it's a copay that I have to make, or outright cash. And that entire experience is all about who I am and what I'm good for and what I have access to. And so those are just two industries, let alone multitude of other ones that have now moved into the digital sphere.
Because the way you describe it, and you see the chain there of not being validated along that chain, that is it that it's taken for granted? Is it that organizations or industries don't know enough to be able to implement proper identity checks? Is it that we should also play a part as the consumer or the person on the other side of the interaction? Or it seems a level of it's just not thought about enough. I don't know.
Naivety. Yeah, I do. I think there's a combination of levels. Like, one, you don't have regulation in some of these industries. You haven't had to have regulation in some of the industries that are forcing service providers to understand what's at risk by not doing this. So that's one. I think secondarily, in at least the world we've been living in the last 4 to 6 months, it's been more about survival. You've had these very antiquated industries that have quickly become digital. And so how do you do that as quickly as possible? And sometimes that comes at the risk of not knowing the risk that you're assuming. And then the third thing, I do think it's about consumer education. And this is where I would tie it to, financial literacy. Like, for years and years and years, particularly in the US, but even globally, you look at the stats that, the next generation beyond us are more financially literate than their previous generation. And part of that is because of self-learning, and that has posed some challenges, particularly as we've experienced a couple of recessions now in our lifetime, where, how do people manage their money more effectively and make decisions? I think it's around, what do you do with your identity, and what do you do with your data? And even in just, the last couple months, we've seen upwards of 20 to 30% an increase in fraud activity or identity theft. And that's a combination of more people being online, so there's more penetration points. But it's a combination of more things being offered online that aren't going through the verification process. And so, whether it's now or quickly in the future, this is a sector that has effectively just been pushed into the spotlight.
It's really true when you think about it, and all of those various interactions that you have. The number of times that you are asked to verify yourself or have some kind of validation of that, certainly few from my perspective. It's almost as if we all rely on, like you say, the naivety or the trust factor, that it's just okay, which I guess if you're shifting it back to financial services is particularly kind of perplexing, maybe, given that it's an industry that's kind of built on trust, or certainly should be built on trust. I mean, how does that sort of identity, not I would say identity crisis is not so much a crisis, is it? But that sort of naivety and maybe not dealing with it in the most efficient way, how has that kind of played out for FI, for example?
Well, I think because of regulation around KYC and eKYC, that there's been forms and fractions of that. But there's always been this question, and particularly when I was at all the companies I've been at, which is, you verify somebody for the first time, like to create an account. And it's always been synonymous with that. And so you checkbox, you meet the regulations. So you've either managing risk, you're managing compliance, you're trying to strive for growth, which means your appetite for risk may be a bit higher, or you need experience, right? And it's kind of those 4 areas that you're constantly trying to balance, because if you introduce too much friction into the processes, you put too much downward pressure on the experience, which don't get people through the funnel. And so in the financial sector, back to your question, it was this one-time event where you verified who you were. And the reality is it's no longer that. It's who I was when I opened up an account at my financial institution 20 years ago is very different than who I am now. And in my life, it may be, I've got a little bit more money in the account, and, I'm still, a trusted person, and I'm still suitable for these services. But that's not the case. We all go through these ups and downs. And so this need for continuous verification is becoming more and more pronounced. And so then the question ends up becoming, I think, for not just the financial sector, but for all sectors, is what and when do you prompt a consumer to interact, give you more information, or to opt in with more consent, versus what can happen behind the scenes that is much more passive in nature, that you're continually getting verified, so your identity isn't at risk without you having to interact. And where do we find comfort in that, ultimately, when it comes down to our own behavioral information? Because, as you said, like, trustworthiness is paramount to success, and that trust halo, whether it's a financial institution or whether it's Airbnb or whether it's Uber, goes much further beyond than just the one-time event.
Yeah, sure. And talking about when you set up a bank account, I mean, I know I've changed certainly since that's happened. I've probably got less money, I think, than when it started.
We all do it this time, Matthew. So.
But I mean, do you think that, is it important then that identity as a concept is treated more kind of fluidly? Is it that it's often set very rigidly from when you establish your identity, for example, with that institution or that organization or that company that you work with?
I absolutely do. I mean, I do think identity is fluid, and I think identity is contextual, and I think identity changes based on the conditions in what you're trying to achieve. And I think it sounds odd for somebody who's always associated identity to be gender-based or national-based or whatever is on your national identity card. But, identity, in my view, takes many different forms. I mean, who you are when you're interviewing me, Matthew, is probably very different than who you are when you're off camera.
You've seen right through me.
I got this special technology right now. It's kind of giving you characteristics of who you are based on your facial expressions. So, but someone said that to me once. They said, when you get up and go to work is different than when you're at home, and vice versa. And it's not that, the essence of who you are changes, but your intentions change and what's important changes. And if you go to a bar, like, you need to know you're over 21 in some states or countries and over 18 in some others. And why do you need to know everything else about you? So I do think it's fluid, and it changes, and the signals around you, are much more robust than they've ever been. And so, I'll give you a specific example. I have a family member of mine who, went through a difficult divorce, and that came some changes to their credit score and what they could access. This is a really good person who's made good money, who has done really wonderful things, and a bad relationship put her in a situation where she could no longer have the credit to continue to support herself. And I think what a shame, because it's, again, the context of her life, not something that got caught in a risk model that was very stagnant and not dynamic. And you're seeing that now with, the gig economy, and the self-employed. Like, they're having a hard time getting access to the types of financial services, what's their lifestyle, and that shouldn't be the case.
No, and it's, I mean, we're getting quite conceptual about identity, which is great. It's really interesting. But the way you talk about it being so fluid, and I guess if you take the work analogy to being at home, how I interact with my bank, for example, compared to as I do with other kind of consumer sites or something like that is very different as well. But does that add, I mean, I guess that adds a massive layer of complexity in terms of managing that data about you, because does the data almost have to be siloed? Because, for example, one interaction with my bank about a mortgage may be very different to how I interact about some other financial activity or something. So is there a real complexity there of managing data about people so that you can verify that identity, if my question makes sense?
It does make sense, although I would challenge your position that it should be siloed. I actually think that how we do this is in a very integrated, secure manner. The recent pandemic highlighted a lot of structural inadequacies in how we manage, use, verify, and monitor identities. And, one of that, effectively includes identity verification and making sure that you can combat the fraudsters. And to do that, fraudsters play on siloed bits of information, right?
Sure.
And so they penetrate one organization, they pull some information, they penetrate another because 40% of the people actually use the same password or some derivative of the password, as you know. I think LinkedIn 2 years ago saw that when they had a data breach, like it was just unbelievable how consistent these passwords were. But they're able to achieve their end state with, financial crimes or defrauding because they integrate all of the information together that gives them a whole complete picture of the person. And so we need to do the same when we're looking at people's identities and then managing and masking those identities. And so I think it's actually breaking down the silos. And where the challenge and the complexity comes that you mentioned is, one, through storage and ensuring privacy and encryption of the information. Two, for how do you educate, end consumers on how that information is used and what rights they should have. I mean, at the end of the day, no company should own your data. You should own your data and choose how it's used to better your life. And how does the consumer, or does the end consumer, need to understand the different types of fraud out there? Like, one of the types of fraud that is emerging is synthetic fraud. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all.
No.
Well, it's the fastest growing financial fraud. And effectively what fraudsters do is they take real IDs and they change just one element of the ID. And so when you submit it to open up an account, like you can't detect that it's a fake ID because it has a real address. It may have a real person's picture, but it had the document numbers that's changed.
Yeah,
and so it's, there's about $40 billion that are lost in the market to identity fraud and synthetic fraud. And so they're getting so sophisticated. So the question ends up becoming, what's the technology? What is the systematic approach in which you can combat that to protect individuals? And that complexity raises, but just again, back to the financial sector, finance is complex. And so how do you make it simple for people to actually benefit from it? It's the same when it comes to identity.
I think the consumer side is an interesting one because, again, we come back to trust. If you're going to build that trust, how much do you let people control their data or have knowledge of their data and how it's being used? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
So your question was, what is my view on privacy and security? Correct? I think you can have both. I am of a believer that every individual should own their own data, should choose how it's used, should be informed when it will be used, should have to opt in into the consent to it being used, whether it's a particular brand or a brand working with a consortium to solve maybe a fraud issue or improve an experience you have. But that layers on a number of technology challenges. How do you do that? And one of the things that has often been thought about is is it the technology to solve that problem, or is it adoption of existing technology to solve the problem? There's been a lot of discussion, as you know, of blockchain in the last 5 to 7 years. I have always been a believer in the notion of a distributed ledger and using hashes to encrypt data so that they can't be associated with individuals. I don't necessarily think you need the blockchain to do that. Although I have thought that either cross-border payments or identity were the perfect use cases on a blockchain, particularly because of the importance of the transactions as well as the data. But the technology actually exists to do the types of things that we need to. It's more about business adoption and consumer adoption and quite frankly, partnership adoption.
Okay, it leads quite nicely onto adoption. I guess I'm always interested in uptake and adoption, as you say. I mean, with some technology disruption or evolution of technology, there can be resistance, or perhaps that change management process is always not necessarily seamless. I mean, is this something that organizations know they need to do? Is it something that they know they need to get better and they're open to partnerships and collaboration? I mean, maybe it's more of a kind of context question, isn't it? But where is the industry at in terms of really getting involved with making sure that their ID verification is top notch?
I think we're much further along than we were 2 years ago.
Okay.
And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, the fraudsters have becoming full force, and you look at some of the security research, out there, and the number of people that have had their identity stolen. I mean, it's sometimes you don't even know that aspects of your identity been stolen. And identity being, in this context, like your personal information, identifiable information. And so companies had been forced to do that. I think also there's this recognition that no one company is going to solve the identity verification issue. I mean, it's too big of a complex problem for one company to solve. And I was really excited by the announcement just when going through COVID of seeing Google and Apple come together for the first time, and to solve for contact tracing. And there's a lot of debate around privacy and a lot of debate around how do you actually leverage that platform? And I think fast forward, I'm not sure how much success has happened with their intention of coming together and having people build apps on top of that. It bodes a whole another set of, I think, monitoring and policy questions around it. But the idea of when you have to solve these problems that are greater than one person or one company, it forces those partnerships. And it's the same with identity verification. There's so many different types of, creating, managing the identity online that you have to bring the right partners together. And that's happening now. And I think in Europe, I know in Europe, you see a lot of movement with ID consortiums, so bank ID, et cetera. And in the US, you're starting to see more and more of that play out as well. And part of it is built on these stats of consumers believing that, whether it's 50 or 60% of their time, like they would trust, their banks with their data. And so then what does that look like when there are untrusted brands and industries that they have? So we're going to see more and more partnerships. There's no doubt in my mind.
Sure. And I guess it kind of feeds into partnerships where if we were to make the distinction, say, between fintechs, let's say startups, innovative, smaller, challenger banks, neobanks, things like that, and incumbent organizations. I mean, it's a relatively kind of common narrative that there's a distinct advantage in technology use and positioning, with incumbents sometimes having legacy systems or maybe being slower to take on new technology. Is that something that you sort of see in the ID verification sphere? Is there an advantage between being a big tech company, say, coming into the payment sector, as opposed to being an incumbent with legacy infrastructure or outdated systems? And would a partnership solve that? I guess maybe. And is that the sort of partnership that you were meaning?
Yeah, I mean, so where I earlier in our discussion, where I would state that the fintechs and the incumbents coming together will drive the true disruption, because of scale and globality, and then because of technology and innovation and experience. In the identity space, it's a little bit different in my mind. That when you're dealing with the type of information and the different ways of encrypting it, you tend to find people who have more experience with that, having a stronger position of influence in driving it. So there's a lot of startups in the identity space right now. Matthew, as you can imagine, I mean, it's a growing sector. I think I saw a stat the other day that like by 2025, there's going to be a $33 billion market, and it's, growing like at a 16% CAGR or something like that. But I do, it's incredibly capital intensive, number one. Number two is, building the deep neural networks and the machine learning. So there's going to be more the B2B players that I think are disruptive in the identity space. I do believe, and based on what I see, if you look at Apple or Google, and Google's even had some announcements, I think, with a partnership with Qualcomm or Telco or something like that, where they're binding the identity to the actual device, that because they have reach in mass, they're going to play a big, big role in there. But to them to do that, to do IDV, they don't have that experience. And so they're going to have to partner. Now, is it going to be with a small fintech that's been around for years, or a fintech that's been around for 10 years? I know where I would put my bets. So I think that's a little bit of the difference of, in the fintech space, you saw a lot of disruption that was able to, I don't want to say circumvent, policies and regulation, but because they flew under the radar for a while, they were able to do that.
Okay, cool. We haven't really talked about technology much, and I wanted to. It's quite broad, but I guess maybe if we're taking now as a starting point, I mean, what for you are the kind of key technologies or real big innovations or trends that you think will really shift the space over the next few years, and what have really driven the most change in IDV and this kind of area?
I think there's some knowns that we all know, right?
Yeah.
So we wouldn't be able to do this if we didn't have, heavy cloud computing. We wouldn't be able to do this if we didn't have advanced encryption techniques like we do now. We wouldn't be having these conversations if there wasn't an openness to distributed ledgers and how you deal with big data problem sets. I do think that there's two that one has been around for a while that I've just familiarized myself with over the last 2 years that I do think is going to be a game changer. And another one is being used now. And I can give an example of how we use it internally. So the one that, I do think will be a game changer is zero knowledge proof, which is effectively saying, through the use of a set of information based on that use case, this gets into, again, identity being fluid. There is a third party who can verify that, say, Matthew, you're over 18 and therefore are able to do X, Y, and Z. And they can do that without sharing where you live, where you're from, your name, your behavior, your social behavior, your financial behavior, all those things that tend to be binded to one answer. Yeah. And that is why I think that's interesting. And it in the technology is interesting is because it ends up de-risking how you use information for a particular use case. So saying I'm 18 and I can do something versus, saying I'm 40 and I'm able to secure a mortgage, require different levels of information to be shared and different types of third parties to validate it. And so that to me, I think it's going to be really interesting as we move forward. The other aspect of it is, hashing effectively, which, is a powerful technique in where you can encrypt data structures, mathematically and organize them much more easily. And effectively, with the new type of hashing techniques that exist today, you can't reverse engineer them. And so one of the things that we actually just launched about a week or two ago was a platform called Instinct, which was all around adaptive behaviors and analytics, where we would effectively be able to look at an ID, like a government ID. We would do a couple hashes on that data. We would remove any access to that raw data, so we no longer keep that on file. But within that hash now, we're able to see if that ID with all those specific criteria and attributes come up in other ecosystems and partners. And if it does, and there's a conflict, so if that ID comes up and the document number is different, we can actually tag it to say, this is synthetic fraud, this is a fraudster. They got through your front door over here in your customer, but we found them over here. We're going to retroactively tell you to stop servicing them to ensure that you mitigate fraud. And those hashing techniques allow you to do that now, which just open up, open up the funnel for a lot more opportunity for us to solve for fraud where we couldn't before.
Right. This is fascinating stuff, Carey. I'm getting a bit nervous. We're getting up to the hour, and I'm thoroughly enjoying myself. I mean, I don't want to take up too much more of our time and go too beyond the hour, but I'm really interested because, and again, it may be a bit conceptual because we were talking about that a little bit. But I mean, where do you see IDV going? I mean, what the perfect system, if indeed it can even be reached perfection, what does that look like in terms of an ecosystem, in terms of how perhaps different industries or different organizations that we interact with look like? I mean, can you build one, I guess, complete identity of a person that can be used in such a way across everything? I don't know. Maybe I'm getting a bit conceptual, but you see where I'm sort of going with the future? What would be the ultimate, I guess, in terms of real security in IDV?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about kind of the utopia
Have you got another
here.
5 or 10 hours?
Yeah, I mean, everybody's trying to crack that problem. I mean, so I'm not going to even attempt to do that in the next 7 minutes. But someone once said to me, "What does the world look like without a physical issued identity? Like, what does that look like? And how do the 1.7 billion people in the world who don't have a nationally issued ID engage in the world around them?" And this then I think poses, and this is conceptual as well, is I actually believe there's a bigger discussion to be had, which is about when the convergence of identity and payments and behavioral data gets to a point where it's real. You're talking about access, Matthew. Like, you're talking about getting permission or entitlements to access your money, to access your home. In Hong Kong, as you've got Octopus that effectively is the same card to pay that allows you to get into your home, that allows you to pull money from the teller. And so, access to things that you should be suitable for and things that you shouldn't. Like, it ends up allowing you to protect yourself against yourself sometimes, particularly when you're trying to manage spend and things like that. And I don't ever believe there'll be one system. You can't. There's too much inherent risk by creating one system. If that system is ever breached, you can't recover from that. No. And I think a lot about that with biometrics right now, which is a topic we didn't discuss. Like, biometrics is another layer of technology, in my view, that has been a catalyst for verification. Because at the end of the day, like, I could have an identity, but it doesn't mean that identity belongs to me. That identity maybe make me permissible to certain things, but that's not actually me. It may be legit, but yet biometrics is interesting because biometrics, like, you can't reverse engineer a breach of that. Like, you can change your password. You can't change your face schematics and the mathematical vectors that are created by verifying who you are. And so, I've started to really believe in the idea of distributed information and also layered information. Like, I think replacing your password on your phone with your face, a selfie, or your fingerprint is actually wrong. It's like just replacing the password issue. I mean, I think it has to be a combination of, what are you trying to do? It's got to be randomized and it's got to be layered depending on the risk. And that's how you can ensure that you aren't having identity fraud. And so it's a little bit more tactical question or answer to your question, Matthew. But I do think of a world where IDs are issued. They aren't physical, but they still have the same characteristics of having third-party validation. And you see that in the Middle East now. You see that in cashless societies now. But again, it's ensuring the integrity of what something has given to you that identifies who you are and who proves that who you are. That is going to be the big challenge for us.
Sure. We've worked through all of the points that I kind of had. I mean, I appreciate we've probably scratched the surface on a lot of them, and we could go into far more detail, which may be something that I'd like to pick up with you separately, Carey, after this. It's been really fascinating. It's been a fascinating call. I mean, are you happy we've kind of covered everything? I don't want to leave any kind of big black holes of anything that's really crucial that I guess formed part of that discussion.
Look, it's a deep, robust topic, and I think it's one that's just on the edge of getting a lot more attention as we go forward, almost where fintech was 5 years ago, and then how that has become at the forefront of a lot of change and news. So, no, I appreciate the conversation. I'd love to continue having the discussion with you. I think that as you take sector by sector and you think about identity verification and then the multiple layers to protect that, it takes kind of different twists and turns. So it could be interesting.
Yeah, it's been great. I've really enjoyed myself. I'll let everyone take a breather. It's been really good talking to you, Carey. Thank you so much. And
yeah, thank you very much. It was good to spend some time with you, and have a great weekend.
Yeah, you too. Thanks so much.
Right.
Stay safe.
Cheers. Stay safe.
And best
Safe
wishes.
and healthy.